Order for Tuesday, November the 13th. Jordan, roll call, please.
Councilmember Bunceness.
Here.
Johnson. Lunsman.
Here.
Olson.
Here.
Remley.
Here.
Ronayne.
Here.
Rux.
Here.
Slide Hansen.
Here.
Mayor Leveson.
Here, Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we need a motion for last week's minutes approval.
Second.
Motion Slade Hansen, second by Remley. If there are no changes, all in favor of approving, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. And from our Planning and Zoning Department tonight for open forum, presentation of housing study. Brett has brought Scott Knudsen from Community Partners Research. And Scott, you're going to handle this and just let Brett
Sit here and look good.
sit there and pretend that he had something to do with it? Or?
I guess I'll take direction from him.
All right.
Yes.
Anyway, Scott, you have the floor for as long as you want it. We don't have that much else to do, so take your time and do what you want.
Well, good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight.
Can you take it? Thank you.
Is it a green light?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
We have a huge audience.
Once again, good evening. Thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Scott Knudsen with Community Partners Research. I was the lead person from our company that worked on this 2018 housing study update. I was also the same person that took the lead in 2010, the last time the full-blown housing study had been done. And after 2010, I actually worked on a couple project-specific studies in the community. So I bring some long-term perspective on growth and some of the housing development activity and programs that have been used in the community. What I brought for you tonight was a draft housing study. It's still considered a draft, but I think we're rapidly moving towards trying to get it finalized. The document itself is about 170 pages long, and it's text heavy, it's data heavy, and it makes for some uninteresting reading at certain points in time. But what we've done is, if I can turn your attention to the inside of the cover of the handout I provided you, we have sectioned this document into these following sections. The executive summary, which is the document I'm handed out tonight and would hope to cover with you tonight. But also in the master document, there's a short introduction, a section on demographic data, a section on projection data, trying to look forward over a 5-year projection period as far as housing needs, a section on income and housing costs, a section on existing housing data, and that's kind of a catch-all for things like what's been built, building permit tracking, home values, age of housing, lot availability, some of the existing infrastructure related to the housing stock. Rental housing inventory is broken out, where we took a look at multifamily rental properties that exist in the community and analyzed those by market segment. Then specifically a senior housing with services section, where you're looking at things like assisted living, skilled nursing homes, memory care housing. Those types of things are broken out again in their own section. A piece on employment and local economic trends that includes some information about commuting patterns, standardized information on unemployment rates, workforce size, those types of things. Finally, moving into the findings and recommendations, which are then broken down into these different categories of a rental, ownership, housing rehabilitation, some other housing issues that surface, that type of thing. I do want to point out, though, that this document, this 2018 update, is largely based on the 2010 housing study, and we pretty much took some of that same format and content and advanced it forward with new information, new findings, whatever we could collect that was better information this time around to update and spruce up that document. Jumping to the executive summary itself, which is still like 14 or 15 pages long, but it's better than the 170-page version that it comes from. And what we've attempted to do here is capture some of the highlights of the larger document. One of the first things that I do want to point out for you, and I always like to talk about this when I'm working with cities in South Dakota, is that demographic analysis overview. Between the actual decennial census, in this case the 2010 census and the future 2020 census, we've typically had some fairly poor data at times on demographic. information. Part of that's due to the fact that the state of South Dakota itself does not issue estimates or projections, so we have to turn to these outside data sources. In the past, they were oftentimes very flawed for a community like Aberdeen. This time around, I guess I'm happy to say that the information was better. I still don't think it was perfect, but it was much better at capturing, I think, the growth that's been going on in this community. And we were able to use the Esri data source this time around as one of our primary data sources. That is a source that's used by the Governor's Office of Economic Development for the state of South Dakota, so we adopted that as our primary data source when we're looking at current year estimates and future projections. Jumping into some of the demographic highlights here at the bottom of the page, again, there's been long-term population and household growth as we've tracked it in the city of Aberdeen over time. The best available evidence would suggest the city has probably been averaging more than 300, somewhere between 301 and 308 people per year so far in the current decade. Now, that's an annual average. Some years will be above or below that, but solid population growth for the community. Flipping the page, more important to me as a housing study person is the number of households that exist in the community. The best information suggests that the city has been adding 140 or more households. And if you look at that in that top bullet, when we were here before, we looked at average growth, say in the 1990s, excuse me, and there we were tracking probably about 56 households in a typical year in the 1990s. In the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010, it jumped up to about 87, 85 to 90 households in a typical year. Now the best information actually suggests that since 2010, the community has been growing at a pace of, say, 140 or more households per year. So the incremental numeric growth of the community continues to increase over time. And that adds a lot of demand for housing, obviously. One last point here in the demographic section, just to point out what we've talked about in previous studies, and I'm sure what you've heard before, is the aging of the existing population. It isn't unique to Aberdeen. It's South Dakota. It's the upper Midwest. It's the United States as a whole, but the advancement of the baby boom generation through the aging cycle. And we continue to track that here. Over the next 5 years, numeric growth will be especially strong in that age cohort between 65 and 74 years old, kind of the heart of the baby boom generation in the next 5 years. After the year 2022, 2023, the leading edge of the baby boom starts to turn 75 and older, and so longer term you start to look at what I'd call an older senior population growing in size in the community. And again, that's not unique to you, it's what's happening in this part of the world. Some of the projection highlights that we want to jump into, that first bullet there, it's very important for us to try and look at realistic projections for the community for household growth. We settled in on a number of about 150 households per year in a typical year going forward over the next 5 years. I do point out, with some degree of embarrassment, that when we projected for this community in the past, we've tended to be overly conservative. I think the last time we came into the community, we were projecting something like 80-some households per year going forward in this current decade, and instead it's been 140 or more. So this, too, may prove to be a conservative projection, but it's the best information we can lay our hands on, and it seems reasonably consistent with the patterns of the recent past. But that's 150 households a year creates pretty significant demand for ongoing housing development in the community.
Just as a quick question, if we were averaging 87 a year leading up to 2010 and we've reached an average of 140, that would indicate to me that we're well over 140 now, just to bring that average up to that.
I'm saying that from 2010 forward, yeah.
We've averaged 140, right?
I think so, over the last 7 or 8 years.
And if we started from 90, in order to average 140, we would already have to be in like the 160 or 170 range.
You certainly could. Yeah, I mean,
right.
The community itself, though, has had remarkably, as I was going to talk about,
Right.
has had remarkably, I think, steady growth. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily been dipped at certain places. I just think over time you just continue to see those numbers go up.
Okay.
If I'm understanding that question correctly.
It has to be a lot higher to get the average.
Right. Yeah.
I guess the third from the bottom point here, in order to achieve that growth, though, you are going to have to build new housing units. I mean, there's some excess capacity in this community. There's some excess capacities I'll talk about in the rental segment. But overall, generally speaking, there's not a lot of available housing. So to continue to grow, you're going to continue to see housing development activity if you're going to achieve some of these numbers. Again, the age-based forecasts I've kind of already touched on. I guess I just would say that some of the sources that we looked at here at the very bottom of the page have projected that the number of younger adult households will actually possibly diminish or hold steady. That's what the projections tend to say for households, say 54 and younger. But I do think in a community like yours that has job opportunities and things like that, I think there's a very good possibility you'll defy those projections and you'll actually be adding younger households because people will move here for jobs. Some of that, however, may also be from immigrant populations, international populations that are also younger in age, typically when they relocate for job opportunities. And even though we don't have great statistics on international immigration, we certainly picked that up in the research that you've had Southeast Asian populations, East African populations, Hispanic, Latino populations continue to grow in the community too. And that can change the age dynamic of who locates in the community and who lives in the community. The next page, page 4, deals with some of the income and housing cost highlight information. I can get kind of bogged down on this page, and I don't want to do that. In some of my trial runs, I kind of took way too much time in my own little dry speech on this. But what I guess I'd like to point out is in that second bullet down, what we're seeing for the city of Aberdeen. Now, we had to pull income statistics from 2016 information from the American Community Survey, but in that second bullet down, the median household income estimate for the city of Aberdeen was $46,330. So that's the midpoint of all households living in the community. That was lower than the Brown County median. It was lower than the state of Minnesota median. But again, that's not a surprise given the fact that Aberdeen is the location of most of the renter households, a lot of retirees and seniors on fixed incomes, and those types of things. So that's the number that we're looking at. Over time, as we looked at it, there has been growth in the median household income. There has also been overall growth in the different income ranges. And growth was particularly strong in Aberdeen for households earning $75,000 or more. And so that was a real positive sign in terms of housing, because people with $75,000 or more in annual income do have choices they can make when looking at housing. They do have some ability to apply income to housing and look at higher priced units, higher priced rental units, look at ownership, those types of things. But there was a significant disparity, kind of that middle bullet point, between owners and renters. And this exists in every community, but within the city of Aberdeen, the median household income for renter households now was less than $29,000, where the median household income for owner households in the next bullet was $66,450. So there's this big disparity that exists between somebody that owns and rents their housing. And some of this is kind of intuitive, of course. People with less money have a harder time buying housing, so they end up in the rental market. But what you end up with is you end up with a lot of the lower income people and the more moderate income people in the rental stock, and the higher income people owning their housing unit. And when you have about 62% of all your renter households in the city in 2016 that had an annual income of $35,000 or less, that's a large number of renter households that have a fairly limited amount they can apply to their housing costs on a monthly basis, unless they incur what's known as a housing cost burden. And indeed, what we did see is there was quite a few renter households that did have that housing cost burden, applying 30% or more of their income for housing, and most of those were actually applying 35% or more of their income for housing. So again, you look at the median, but then if you break it down by tenure, you tend to see a different scenario for owners versus renters. There were some homeowners at the bottom of the page that also had a housing cost burden, but typically those were people with fairly low incomes that were still homeowners. Oftentimes we may think that's people that have retired and gone from an earned income to a fixed income, and as a result, it appears that they have a housing cost burden because their income has dropped. Jumping to page 5, some of the existing housing inventory highlights. Obviously, for those of you that live here, you've seen these strong construction patterns that have existed for homes and rental apartments in the community. And again, what I guess I'd like to point out is, as I look at this community compared to others that I've worked in, you've had a remarkably steady, I mean, there have been yearly ups and downs in housing starts for single-family homes, but overall, you've really produced, over the long term, quite a few houses each year. And when we looked at an average from the year 2010 to 2017, it was about 74 single-family housing starts per year that we thought were intended for owner occupancy. So fairly strong annual production of single-family housing starts. When we looked at home values in the community for existing home sales, that second bullet, what we were seeing was a median home sale price of about $156,000 for an existing house now, not for new construction, but for an existing house. We only had access to 2017 sales records. We did not have access to the 2018 yet, but there was a pretty significant jump in home values between 2016 and 2017. And so that indicates to us that there's probably strong demand for those existing houses that are out there and up for sale that are in good condition. Third bullet down, there were some concerns in 2018 because I don't think 2018 is going to probably achieve your average in terms of single-family housing starts. But what we were hearing in the interview process that we did is some of that was tied to lot availability, and that some of the subdivisions that had previously been available in the past were largely built out. There wasn't an overly large supply of lots later in 2018, and that may have suppressed some home building activity in the current year. However, by the research we could do and talking to Brett and some of the other people in the community, there were a lot of different subdivisions that were underway later in the year and expected to come online. It does not appear that lot availability is much of an issue, I don't think, in 2019. We were estimating 300 or more vacant lots could be out there in the inventory by next year in multiple locations for people to choose. We actually looked at a longer 10-year time period for rental housing from 2009 to 2018 because 2009 was a very strong multifamily construction year too. And over that time period, we were tracking more than 1,000 multifamily rental units that have been built in the city of Aberdeen. So over a 10-year time period, really strong rental production, an average of about 108 housing units per year. We did find that this led to some unused capacity. There was some vacancy in the higher rent conventional segment of the market when we did our rental survey, but in general terms, most of those 1,000+ units have been fairly well absorbed over time in the community, at least in our opinion, based on what we could see. Last bullet on this page, developers in Aberdeen have also been, at least in my opinion, been successful in securing some resources for more affordable rental. Now, granted, most of the stuff that's been built is higher rent housing and it's conventional market rate housing, but there have been at least 4 tax credit projects that advanced. Tax credit resources are difficult to secure in the state of South Dakota. I mean, they're competitive resources, and your developers have done well and brought 160+ units online since the year 2010. So adding to a more affordable, more moderately priced rental stock. There is some information here on the top of page 6 about some of the comparisons of incomes to rental distribution. Let me just say that in general terms, you have an undersupply of units that are very affordable, say $500 a month for rent based on the number of lower income renter households. But again, that's fairly typical. No one really is able to create rental units for $500 or less through new construction. So really that supply is fixed or declining over time. And you have more low-income renter households than you have units in that lower price range. However, you also have a fair number of renter households that can afford, say, $900 or more. And at least when the 2016 American Community Survey was conducted, you had an undersupply of those higher-priced units, say $900 and up, based on the number of renter households that were out there that could afford those. I think that's why you've continued to see some conventional rental development, and that's why you've seen most of those units get absorbed, because there are some renters out there, 36 to 40%, that can, say, afford $900 or more within this rental market. As far as the rental market highlights itself from our rental survey, we would guess that based on what we could see, the overall housing tenure rate in the city of Aberdeen is about 42% or higher for rental housing, 58% or less homeowners. That rental tenure rate has been increasing over time. Again, as we look back on those construction statistics, you produce more rental housing than you have single-family housing starts in recent years, and the rental rate continues to increase. We did conduct that survey of multifamily rental properties. The survey was primarily conducted in July. We contacted nearly 2,000 kind of traditional rental units, plus that supply of units that serve seniors with some kind of services like assisted living, memory care, or things like that. So well over 2,000 rental units in the community were contacted for rent and occupancy information. We did find a vacancy rate above 6% in the conventional segment of the market. Much of that was clustered in some of the newer buildings that had a higher rent structure. Some of those managers indicated that they expected those vacancies to disappear once students started returning to the community. We made a few follow-up phone calls in October and found that generally speaking, those vacancies were still there. So I'm not sure the students solved the problem completely. There may have been some pickup, but there was still probably a slightly above average vacancy rate in some of the newer projects. But I guess I would point out at the top of the next page that when you look at the more moderately priced conventional segment, I think the occupancy rates there were very, very high. I mean, if you had a building that was 20, 30 years old, had a much more moderate rent structure. People talked of multiple phone calls looking for units. They talked about long-term tenants that didn't tend to move. Those units didn't tend to turn over. If somebody found something they could afford that was in decent condition. There continues to be a wide variation, the second bullet down there, in the rates for market rate rental housing. You have a broad mix of units, some very old rental housing, some very new rental housing. So there is a wide range of rents that are being charged in the community. Third bullet down, obviously you have students living in the community. They make up a portion of the rental market. We did not necessarily find, however, too many projects that largely catered to students. Obviously, there's some newer buildings near the university that have a lot of students, but most of those buildings described that they were general occupancy. You didn't have to be a student to live there. So generally speaking, students are being housed in these multiple new buildings that have been constructed around the community. In the moderate rent income-based segment, generally served by low-income housing tax credits, there was a high rate of occupancy. Few vacancies were recorded and waiting lists were very common. So again, as you start moving into that more affordable realm, demand is pretty good and waiting lists tend to exist. The supply of federally subsidized rental housing in Aberdeen has not really changed much in many decades, largely because the federal government is involved when subsidized housing gets built, and the federal government hasn't funded subsidized housing in quite a long time. You haven't necessarily lost subsidized units in recent years, but you really haven't gained them either. So that most affordable type of rental housing has remained rather fixed, despite the fact that the community continues to grow and add renter households. The tenant-based voucher program also continues to exist through the Aberdeen Housing Authority. However, over time, that probably serves fewer households too. As the cost per household goes up to subsidize rents, they actually are serving fewer households over time. Waiting lists tend to exist for those rent assistance vouchers. So in the very affordable segment, there's pent-up demand that's certainly evident in the form of waiting lists. In terms of some of the senior housing with services highlights on the bottom of 7, top of 8, there really hasn't been much change in that inventory since we were here in 2010. I don't think there's really been any new buildings built per se. There have been some changes of use where somebody that might have once had a wing dedicated to memory care use has converted that to assisted living. So there may have been some change in the rooms or the bed utilization, but overall the supply of units is largely fixed. Occupancy rates remain high in nearly all of the different segments. Some of the providers, however, would not disclose occupancy patterns, but we assume them to probably be high based on the fact that the number of older seniors continues to grow in the community, and there really hasn't been anything new built in very many years. So we'd assume that occupancy rates are generally high. Even though there has been growth, there hasn't been tremendous growth in the number of older seniors, but I think going forward, you're going to continue to see that ramp up, and including, like I talk about, the baby boomers after the year like 2022 starting to enter some of those 75 and older age ranges. Longer term, you're going to see a greater growth curve in some of those patterns for tenant markets that are served by housing with services. Employment and economic trends here on page 8. Obviously, you've got a low unemployment rate. Living here, you all know that. You've got job growth in the community. You know that. Because of your location, probably because you're not really close to any other larger regional centers, most people tend to work fairly locally. People in Aberdeen that don't work right in the city generally don't have to commute very far for employment. Most are commuting 25 miles or less, or 25 minutes or less. Likewise, people that don't live in Aberdeen but work in your community, most of them are coming from a 20, 25-mile radius at most. Certainly you get some longer distance commuters, but a lot of the people that work here live in the immediate region, and I think they're willing to commute from a place like Groton or Ipswich or wherever they may be coming from to fill the jobs that exist in the community. Jumping now to the last segment of this executive summary, the pages 9 onward, talking about some of the recommendations summary, findings and recommendations. Again, if you look at this in terms of, say, 150 households per year, average household growth, you're looking at 750 households over a 5-year projection period just from growth-generated demand. We didn't add a lot to that. We added like another 100 units for some unit replacement, because each year you probably have some units that are lost to demolition, removed from the housing stock, natural disasters. I mean, years ago you had the flood losses, for instance, and some things like that have removed houses over time. But we were looking at something like a goal of about 850 housing units being created over the 5-year projection period. Now, that's not to say more units couldn't be created, but we're trying to tie some of our recommendations to what we see as anticipated growth and demand. Housing can be a very competitive business, certainly within some of these different sectors, like rental housing and senior housing with services. And you may see greater production than we're talking about here, but that would be people trying to capture a larger market share, trying to take tenants from somebody else, a new assisted living coming in, for instance, that's trying to get people from an older assisted living facility on a competitive basis. We distributed this housing recommendation into about 55% owner occupancy units and 45% renter occupancy units. Now, granted, in the recent past, renter production has exceeded home ownership production, but we expect those patterns to stabilize some going forward. We actually went through, those periods in the early 2010s, 2010, 2012. Even though you didn't see a tremendous drop in home building in this community, it was kind of a downtime for home ownership. We continue to see that rebounding. We think growth or demand for owner occupancy housing will continue to increase over time. That has led us to apply a rough forecast of about 94 owner occupancy units per year. Let's just say 90 to 95 in a typical year being potential demand. And within the rental segment, say about 77 is the average per year. Somewhere between, say, 75 and 80 units per year would be a reasonable expectation for year-to-year demand for additional housing units. That leads us to then come up with a recommendation that as many as 375 to 400 total rental units be created over that 5-year projection period to the year 2023. As we turn to page 10, we've talked about different market segments that would be addressed within this recommendation. We would see market potential for, say, 40 to 50 conventional market rate units per year, or over the 5-year period, maybe 200 to 250. In a perfect world, you'd see maybe fewer created in this segment of the market and more in the more affordable segments of the market, but realistically, that's not going to happen. And most of the rental production is going to continue to occur in this conventional rental segment, which generates a little higher rent structure. But it has been successful. There is a little bit of oversupply right now, but we would expect that to be absorbed fairly shortly by household growth. Number 2, we would recommend the community continue to develop the moderate rent units, say through the tax credit program, and 70 to 80 units becomes a realistic expectation for the next 5 years. That's probably 2 projects. Every couple of years, putting a new tax credit project into the inventory, 30 to 50 units has been typical. That would add 70 to 80, let's say, over this 5-year projection period. If developers are successful in securing more resources, that number may be exceeded, but that seems realistic given the competition that exists for those resources in the community. Goal number 3 of developing 30 to 40 subsidized rental units. We state this as a goal because actually doing this is going to be extremely difficult. You'd have to apply a lot of resources to get very low rent structure with rent based on income. But to the extent that, say, in some of these tax credit projects, some rent skewing can go on, and some units can get down to, say, 30% of median income rent structures and things like that. That would be ideal if you could somehow develop some very affordable housing in this community, or possibly getting some project-based vouchers that go into some of these projects to help lower-income people live there. Number 4, promote the development of specialized memory care housing. We do tend to see this segment of the specialized care as being the one that's the most underrepresented in the city of Aberdeen, and largely that's because some of the existing providers have exited that segment of the market. I would guess that has a lot to do talking with some of them about the regulatory restrictions, the staffing requirements, the liability concerns. And if you've got people with memory loss issues, they're subject to things like wandering or trying to leave a facility or, those types of things. So they're secure environments. Some people, I think, have exited that. As a result, you have a relatively small supply of memory care housing in this community. Now, that's not to say people with memory loss aren't being served by other housing options, like skilled nursing homes and the like. But in most communities, you tend to see more memory care housing out there, and we see that as a market opportunity going forward. Page 11, number 5, support the development of additional senior housing with services. Again, it's been quite surprising that really there have been no new assisted livings built in this community, I think in more than 10 years. Although we did pick up one that's pending out there, but I actually, with my extra time this evening, I drove by there, and it doesn't look like anything has broken ground on that, so I'm not sure what the plan is for that or if anybody actually knows what the plan is for that. But it wouldn't surprise me that in the near future somebody advances an assisted living type facility. Certainly adding 40 to 50 units within the assisted living light services realm is very reasonable given the expected growth in the older senior populations. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that number gets exceeded by what gets developed over the next 5 years. Again, that's a very competitive segment of the housing market, where people will try and serve that segment. Updated findings on lower income seniors, number 6. We throw this in here just to continue to put it in front of people. Lower income seniors that need services with their housing don't have a lot of options in Aberdeen. Most of your assisted living providers are private pay. Some will accept county assistance programs, but they cap that assistance. There's really nothing you as a city or as a city council can do about this. This is a reimbursement issue with the state assistance and the county assistance for lower income seniors. But again, if there's something that can be done to help promote lower income seniors getting services like assisted living, that would help because that segment is not broadly served in Aberdeen. Updated findings on student housing, number 7. We didn't have the world's greatest statistics on students, but as near as we can tell, now this may be open to challenge, but as near as we can tell, it's probable that the student population, the traditional student population in the community hasn't grown over time. There probably has been some growth in enrollment, but that's oftentimes due to things like online learners, remote campuses, students taking PSEO class or high school and in the colleges type classes, those types of things. So enrollment growth may have occurred, but from what we could learn from Northern State, it is probable that the number of students taking classes in Aberdeen has not necessarily been growing over time. As a result, we didn't see anything particular to student housing recommendations. Students are being served in the rental market. They're living in these new apartment buildings that get built. I mean, that certainly doesn't rule out a student project if someone has a location near campus, but it isn't like it's a pressing need and that you're losing students because of a lack of student housing. Number 8, continue with innovative efforts to assist renter households. That's actually a carryover from 2010 when we were talking about programs. We know the Aberdeen Housing Authority continues to do innovative things, down payment, security deposit assistance programs and those kinds of things. Again, you do have a number of renter households out there with lower incomes, and those programs are encouraged. Jumping to page 12, home ownership recommendations. We continue to see fairly strong demand for single families. I've talked about 90 or more single family housing starts, say 90 to 95 per year is certainly achievable. That would be higher than the recent past, but not substantially higher. We continue to support the construction of 20 to 25 affordable houses per year. You have a very unique community in that this number would not be typically that high in most of the other communities we work in because most communities simply can't achieve that entry-level segment very well. It's really hard to serve people. But with the Happy organization here, you've actually done, you've outperformed most communities within that segment. They've concentrated on affordable lots and affordable homes and home ownership assistance types of programs. Number 10 and 11 really kind of go together. We see most of the demand continuing to exist for what I'd call moderately priced, say up $225,000, $250,000 or more, into the higher price segment, say $350,000 or more in the community. And that's simply a function of the cost of construction. I mean, it's really hard to build a new house for less than $250,000. Those people that are buying houses are primarily going to be into those areas. It's going to be those folks with incomes above $100,000 oftentimes. It's going to be people that are selling an older existing house that bring equity to the deal and can afford to trade up in their housing situation. Number 13, promote affordable existing home ownership options. Again, you have an older existing housing stock in the community. Typical price might be considerably less than new construction alternatives. We were estimating about $156 based on the sales activity we had. That becomes a better fit for entry-level home buyers is to buy an existing house, provided they're out there for sale and that they're desirable for people to move into. Continue to utilize home ownership assistance programs. Number 13, again, we've already kind of talked about Happy, but as interest rates start to climb, when we started this study, interest rates weren't necessarily climbing, but in the last couple of months, the interest rates have kind of ticked up a little bit. If they continue to go higher, that'll put more pressure on entry-level home buyers. And so things that Happy does, like tapping into rural development assistance programs, mortgage down payment assistance, those become more important for marginal home buyers. Just trying to check my time here and see how I'm doing. Consider purchase rehabilitation resale. I throw this one out there simply because we've seen more communities start to go to this route. Instead of trying to build affordable new construction for home ownership, they're taking a look at their existing housing stock. Is it possible for something like the Aberdeen Housing Authority or Happy or someone else to buy older existing homes, repair them, and put them back up for sale to moderate income buyers? Oftentimes that's going to happen at a loss. There may have to be a subsidy in there that fixing the house up will cost more than what you can actually sell it for in the end, but it reuses that more affordable housing stock. It redevelops some of the neighborhoods. It achieves some other community goals. And like I say, given the fact that new construction prices continue to escalate even for affordable houses, that may become an alternative for affordable home ownership. Number 15, I've already largely talked about that there are a number of subdivisions underway. We were tracking, 3 or 4 different ones at least, and a number of lots should come online within the next year, if not already late in 2018. Next page 14, continue to utilize infill lots for affordable housing development. Again, we know that some ongoing demolition occurs. We know that groups like Happy have been using some of those infill lots. Again, a very good strategy. Habitat for Humanity, building on infill lots. It helps with neighborhood redevelopment. It helps with affordable home ownership. Continue to support affordable subdivision development. Some of these get a little bit redundant, I suppose, but we know that Happy over time has continued to bring new subdivisions online, and they're doing so again. But again, I have to give a lot of credit to this steady pace of home construction and the more activity that goes on in the affordable segment, and so the Happy subdivisions have really contributed to that. Number 18, promote attached single-family housing development. We continue to see this aging population, and we would fully expect that between 25 and 30% of this production that we're talking about would go into the realm of some kind of attached housing, like a twin home, a townhouse, or those types of things going forward. And it would not be unreasonable to expect, say, 25 or 30 of attached units per year in an average year. And in some years, you might even exceed that if say, a townhouse development goes forward. That is well matched to the aging population, the number of households that will be 65 and older, looking for a low maintenance, no maintenance option. Number 19, rehabilitation. Continue to promote rental housing rehabilitation. Based on the stats that we could look at, the median year of construction for rental housing in Aberdeen is about 1973. So half of your rental housing units are, say, mid-70s or older. And so there is a fair number of units out there. Age is not always an indicator of need for rehabilitation, but it oftentimes is an indicator of maintenance and ongoing upgrades to be competitive in the market. So rental housing certainly is an area for rehabilitation activity. Ownership housing is even older. The median age for single-family houses in the community is 1965. So a majority of your houses are more than 50 years old. And again, to keep those habitable for young buyers, to keep those desirable for people in the future, ongoing rehabilitation would be encouraged within that segment of the market. Number 21 was again a carryover from a previous study, but we talked about that in the previous study, the 2010 study about rental licensing and inspection. We don't necessarily render an opinion here, but I just want to point out your share of rental housing continues to grow. More than 42% of your households live in rental housing. And again, you have a fairly large inventory of older rental units in the community, and it may be something that council wants to look at in terms of managing and monitoring that rental housing supply. Last couple of issues, again, carryovers from that 2010 study that we refreshed and updated. We had talked in 2010 about downtown housing. We certainly found that there's been some downtown housing activity. Given the number of units that are needed going forward, it certainly is appropriate to look at downtown locations if they're desirable as a place for, say, some rental housing development. The downtown area continues to revitalize, new businesses opening, those types of things, and there's been some rental developments downtown that have, or near downtown, that have been successful. So that certainly is a viable option for development. Last one, just talking about diversity issues. Between the actual decennial census, we won't have a great handle on the size of minority populations in the community until the 2010 census comes out. What we can tell, though, from the estimates that exist out there is typically the home ownership rates for people that are of Hispanic Latino ethnicity or that are non-white for race tend to be lower than home ownership rates for the white non-Hispanic Latino community. So that creates, in terms of home ownership opportunities, some abilities there to market to those groups to try and strengthen home ownership. And again, you've got vehicles like Happy that can help achieve some of those kinds of goals. So with that, those are the primary highlights. It probably took longer than I wanted, but I think it was fairly close to half hour.
I could listen for another half hour. It's just
my.
It's fantastic. A lot of information. I have one quick question before I throw it open to the council. Do you have a number on the number of rental units in Aberdeen?
I think we actually did make an estimate in here. I will dig for that though, because I'm not going to find that. Well, maybe I will find it fairly quickly.
No, if you don't, that'd be something that would interest a lot of people, I think, just to.
Yes. Without any adjustment for units that may have been lost since the year 2010, the potential rental inventory in Aberdeen may be as large as 5,950 to 6,000 total units by the end of 2018. So let's just say 6,000 for rough discussion would be our best guess. What we did to arrive at that number is we took the 2010 census count on rental housing. We added in everything that we were aware of that had been built since the 2010 census and added that to that total. But like I say, we couldn't subtract much. If there's been buildings torn down or something, we don't necessarily know a lot about those. So
Okay.
5,900 to 6,000. Pardon?
6,000.
Close to 6,000 would be, and about 42%, more than 42% of all occupied households probably live in rental units.
Okay. Very comprehensive and interesting for everybody, I think. Questions? Anybody? Dean?
Yes, page 4, you said that renter household median income is 28,727 and household income is 66,540. What were those numbers in 2010? Did I miss that someplace in your?
Probably didn't. That is not in the executive summary, but it hopefully would be back here. Actually, I'm not sure that I actually had the medians listed in this. We have to go back to that prior document to get that.
Okay.
So, but that's something I can certainly dig up and
Please.
give it to Brett. So,
Those median household income numbers are sometimes kind of skewed based on college kids in a household or 85-year-old seniors living alone with so sometimes those income numbers are different than what they would appear to be. And
absolutely right. I mean, a lot of renter households are one-person households,
Right.
and by definition, they've got one person that can earn income. You start getting into 2 or 3 person, you might have multiple income earners and families and things like that own
or
houses.
just Social Security income.
Yeah, or just
and no
Social
other.
Security, right.
Yeah,
So-
okay. Anybody else? Questions?
Good information.
I had, it seems to me I had something. The 6% vacancy rate. Could you talk about that a little bit in relation to what that should be or how that compares elsewhere? Or what should we be thinking about a 6% vacancy rate?
It's probably higher than your rental landlords would like, but I think typically we look for a 3% to 5% vacancy rate as being perfectly acceptable. And again, perfectly acceptable to me. I don't own rental property. They want it to be full. But I mean, if you're going to have people move to town to claim jobs, you want them to have some choices out there in the market. You don't want them to have one apartment available to them. So a 5% vacancy rate allows them to shop different buildings and things like that. So you're not much above what would be maybe considered acceptable. I guess the thing is those vacancies were probably clustered in 5 or 6 specific buildings where the vacancy rates in those particular buildings may have been 15%, that type of thing.
Okay.
So
Did you get any impression from the landlords you talked to? Did any of them offer any opinions on what you were doing or what you should be doing? Or
well, at the risk of getting myself in trouble, a lot of them would tell me that the community is overbuilt, that the market is saturated. And then I would ask them, so you've got vacancies? Oh, no, my building is full, but I know other people have vacancies, would be kind of the typical thing. So there's a belief out there of a saturated market, and it's based on the fact that there are for rent signs out there, and there are buildings with vacancies. But overall, most of the older properties, more moderate rent properties, are quite full, at least in my opinion. And again, it's the newer buildings where you tend to see the vacancies. So, but as a city council, you need to be aware of that, and I'm sure you do hear that some of the rental property owners and managers think that the community has been overbuilt for rental housing. So,
other questions? If not, Brett, where do we go from here with this?
I guess Lynn and I talked about this. I wasn't sure if it goes to the council for adoption or if it just, becomes a document that we utilize and share with the public.
Actually, what I was going to do, there's a section that's called Special Reports under Planning and Zoning. I was going to take out the 2010 version and replace it with the 2018 version because I know the last time that this study was done, there were several questions from individuals, and a lot of the questions came from the financial institutes where they wanted to see what the report findings were. And so that would be a start. But if, in fact, you want to adopt a motion or resolution, that's fine too. or we could just put it within our records.
The whole 170 pages is going to be available? Not just,
Yeah, on the website.
all right, good.
If he gives us electronic version, we'll post it in tomorrow.
And typically we can, send it to you in those sections too, that if a person just wants to read the section on senior housing with services, for instance, they could just, have it out there in two different formats, sectioned and the entire document, so.
Yeah, if you could send it to me, then we'll work on getting it listed on the website immediately.
Okay.
Are
Okay.
you looking at replacing or just adding this one so people could look back at the old one if they want to
We
also?
could do it both ways. We
I think
could
it-
leave the old one there and we could put on the new one.
I think it's probably a good idea.
Okay, if they want to do a comparison to see some of the changes,
Yeah.
that'll work.
How do we move from draft to actual product?
I guess since the presentation's been given, we're at the actual product now.
Okay. All right.
I don't see any real need for official council action to do anything more with this. I mean, we've all been here and seen it, and we'll see it on the site. So just thanks for your efforts, and obviously an effort made to do some planning before you made this presentation tonight, so you didn't ramble around. It was it moved right along. I impressed with your presentation, really.
Well, thank you. Sometimes the length of the presentation depends on what people give me. I just talk faster or talk slower. So and I think tonight I was rambling pretty good. But anyway,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice work.
Next on our agenda is our consent calendar with just two items, A and B.
Second.
Motion, Lensman, and second by Rux. All in favor of approving those two, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. This the appointed time for a hearing on the application for Act 2 for their special license, November 14 through 18. We need a motion to approve that.
Move.
Motion Slade Hansen, second by Remley. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Next item, ground leases, fixed base operators at the airport, city attorney.
Thank you, Mayor. The city is requesting that the council approve the addendum to the 3 fixed-based operator net aviation ground leases that they have out there. In a review of those, the existing leases, it was very difficult to understand what exactly was the premises that was being leased. None of the leases have any accurate or current designation of the leased premises. So what we've done here in working with each of the FBOs is an addendum that sets out a map that helps to identify what the exact premises is and to allocate among that the various rental amounts because the leases themselves require those. These 3 addendums were all approved, and the airport board has recommended approval of the addendum as well.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion Bunceness and second by Olson. Any questions on this? Lynn?
Can I make a quick comment? And I just wanted you aware of this. The airport board was very impressed with Ron's additional work to better define these leases and to include the map. And so he received a lot of credit for his efforts.
Oh, sure.
I wasn't there, so
Nobody complained about their newly defined property lines? Good, okay. Any other comments on the motion? If not, all those in favor of approving that, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Thanks. Item C is for Robin, change order for Wright and Sudlow for concrete rehab.
You have in front of you the change order and pay request. The change order is primarily an increase in quantities to get it up to what was budgeted. We had 180,000 budgeted. We stayed a little bit under because we did overspend in a few other areas. So we're trying to balance that budget out a little bit. But the change order request is in the amount of $18,233, and the pay request and final is in the amount of $158,953.
Move. Second.
Motion Bunsen, second by Lunsman to make the payment. Any questions on it?
Did we get all the work that we wanted done this year?
Yes. I'll say that with reservation. Typically, we have, we'd like to get a lot of things done, and after you find out how far your money will go, we never get quite everything done. But we took care of the major areas, and we still have plenty of work to do next year, so.
Other questions? Roll call on the motion, please, Jordan.
Councilmember Bunceness.
Aye.
Lunsman.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Remley.
Aye.
Ronayne.
Aye.
Rux.
Aye.
Slide Hansen.
Aye.
Mayor Leveson.
Aye, motion carries. And we have some airport items, and Rich is here to go through them.
Good evening. What I have here is we've got 3 items. The first one is AIP Project 40, which is the complete reconstruction of Taxiway Charlie, Taxiway C, and construction of a new taxiway connector. And the new taxiway connector will put the pilots at a 90-degree angle to the northwest-southeast runway, the 1331. Currently, the way the connector is, the pilots are having to look back over their shoulder at about a 120-degree angle one way and maybe a 40-degree angle the other way. This would be, what we're looking for here is to authorize the city manager to sign the agreement for professional
Okay.
services.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion Bunceness, second by Ronayne. Questions from the council on this? All in favor, then say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. And we can handle the items 2 and 3 together, payments to Helms. Rich?
Okay. These are payments to Helms. Payment number 10 would be for AIP 37, and that is the Airport Wildlife Hazard Assessment. And the next one is AIP 39, and that's for the Airport Master Plan.
Need a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Motion Ruck, second by Olson. Questions on these payments? Jordan?
Councilmember Bunceness.
Aye.
Lunsman.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Remley.
Aye.
Ronayne.
Aye.
Rux.
Aye.
Slide Hansen.
Aye.
Mayor Leveson.
Aye, motion carries. How's your first few weeks in charge, Rich?
It's been interesting,
Well, we haven't had a snowstorm yet, so.
but we've had 3 snow events,
Okay. Yep.
so we've been using the machinery.
All right. Item E is bills presented for payment. City boards, $257,621. Sales tax due to the state, $14,963. TIF bond payment to DTC, $235,272. U.S. Bank principal and interest for the revolving loan fund, $17,334. Great Western Bank TIF payment for TIF number 8, $192,648. November recycling to Dependable, $22,967. UPS charge $98. Northern Electric Utility, $61.69. American News online subscription at the airport, $95. AT&T iPad access for laptops at the airport, $174. And some planting work at the airport for fall. The to Designs de Villiers, $500. Copier use, $75. Payment to Marco. Payment for 8,820 pounds of de-icer at the airport to NAS Industrial, $74.08. And taxiway project for a work at the airport to Altig, $3,500.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion Remley, second Ronan. Questions on any of them? Jordan?
Councilmember Bunceness.
Aye.
Lunsman.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Remley.
Aye.
Ronayne.
Aye.
Rux.
Aye.
Slide Hansen.
Aye.
Mayor Leveson.
Aye, motion carries. Item F is payroll October 28 to November 10, and city share of Social Security, old age and survivors insurance, retirement, health, and life.
Move approval. Second.
Motion Slade Hansen, second by Rux. Jordan?
Councilmember Bunceness.
Aye.
Lunsman.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
Remley.
Aye.
Ronayne. Rux.
Aye.
Slide Hansen.
Aye.
Mayor Leveson.
Aye, motion carries. Lynn?
Okay, thank you. Just for general information, being Rich was here and he was talking about the snow event. In comparison, the airport usually has about 22 events a year compared to whereas Robin only has like 7 to 8 events. And so when you're talking about snow and ice removal, they do their fair share out there. When you're talking 22 events throughout a winter time period.
So don't be complaining, Robin.
We could have snow removal. Sioux Falls just made a news announcement today. They had to transfer an extra $1 million into their snow removal because they're short. into their whole snow removal operation.
Moving on, to keep your interest, at the next meeting, Robin is going to present options for the next arterial street reconstruction project. So that should
Wow.
create some discussions because if you remember right, we were looking between 5 to 6 different options, and so we need consensus from the governing body as to our direction for our next, is it 2020 project?
Yes.
Good luck.
That's all I have at this time.
Okay, we do have an executive session scheduled. Anything before we break for that?
Move to go into executive
Second.
session.
Motion Ronayne, second by Bunsness. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.